Sudanese activists are calling for massive protests against the government's austerity measures. While they do that, security forces have intensified their crackdown against the two-week-old demonstrations. With protests growing and the violence increasing, has the Arab Revolution caught up with Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. As the Sudanese government intensifies its crackdown on anti-government protests that have been going on for almost 2 weeks, activists have geared up for a large demonstration after Friday prayers. The protesters defiantly dubbed their anti-government rallies licking elbows after officials issued a statement telling people who are dissatisfied with the government to do just that. The protests that were sparked by austerity measures have spread from the capital Khartoum to other areas in the country, with people now openly calling for an end to the 23-year-old rule of President Omar al-Bashir. From Khartoum, Zena Khoda reports.
Garifna, an Arabic word which means we are fed up. A pro-democracy group of young activists is at the forefront of a movement they hope will lead to the downfall of the Sudanese government. They have been active on social media websites, calling on the Sudanese people to take to the streets after this Friday's midday prayers. Youth activists who hide their identities because some of them have been detained by the authorities say the protest planned a day before the ruling party celebrates its 23rd year in power will be decisive.
I think Friday is a make or break day for this movement. In the last few days, the demonstrations in Khartoum have sort of died down. I think that's directly a result of the brutal crackdown by authorities.
Undoubtedly, there is anger over the worsening economic conditions here. That is why people took to the streets in the first place. But protests have been relatively small in size. It is not clear whether this is because of fear.
The government has dismissed the protest action. It said a few agitators have been behind the unrest and that the majority of Sudanese support the state. It also accused political parties of exploiting people's grievances for their own political goals.
Many Sudanese don't have much faith in the traditional opposition parties, which still haven't thrown their full weight behind the protest movement. It seems they are waiting to see whether the momentum picks up before making their position clear. A lack of clear leadership has also made it difficult for activists to reach out to the people who are really affected by the economy.
It's really happening spontaneously. You can see that most protests are happening in neighborhoods. And I don't think anyone has any influence over particular neighborhoods. So it's really a felt need. So I wouldn't say there's any direct mobilization or coordination.
There is dissent, but opinions vary on how widespread it is. So the protests on Friday may in part help determine the fate of this country. The turnout will give an indication whether a new attempt for Sudan's Arab Spring will blossom or die out. Zena Khoda, Al Jazeera, Khartoum.
Sudan has faced soaring food prices and a weakening currency since South Sudan seceded last year, taking with it about 3/4 of Sudan's economically vital oil output. Oil revenues also shrank by another 20% after the main Hedgelich oil field was damaged and shut down in fighting with South Sudanese troops in April. This has led to a $2.4 billion budget deficit this year. And in order to plug that deficit, the president unveiled tough austerity measures that include scrapping fuel subsidies, a move that has led to a 60% rise in fuel prices, and raising taxes on consumer goods, banks and imports, which in turn doubled the price of basic goods. So then, has the so-called Arab Spring finally caught up with Sudan? To answer this question, we're joined by our guest in Khartoum, Safwat Fanos, political analyst and head of the Political Science Department at the University of Khartoum. Also in Khartoum, Aissam Abu Hasabu, a senior member of the Democratic Unionist Party. And joining us from Oxford, David Anderson, British political scientist and academic. He's also a professor in African politics and fellow of St. Cross College at the University of Oxford. So let's then perhaps begin our discussion where this protest movement all began at the University of Khartoum. We can speak to Dr. Safwat Fanos about this protest movement, which has, of course, in the last 2 weeks spread beyond a student movement movement and beyond the university campus, is it beginning to lose some of its momentum in Khartoum, or is it still posing a major threat to the government?
It started, as you said, at the University of Khartoum, but then it didn't escalate. Actually, the last 4 days we didn't witness any demonstrations inside the university. But then today there was the call for the people to go out after the Friday prayers, and therefore there are attempts to take the demonstrations beyond the university walls into the wider and the larger society. The reports that I have been getting up to now is that, again, the number of the people on the streets are not very large, and the demonstrations are restricted to certain mosques, to certain areas of the capital, and therefore we are not really witnessing anything near what we have seen in the Arab Spring, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Syria, and in Yemen, for example, or in Libya, for that matter.
The numbers may not be large, but would you say, though, that the fear factor has been broken, that it is no longer a major factor, that the barrier of fear has been broken, and therefore it may be more difficult for the government to contain these protests, which, as you say, have spread beyond the capital?
It is still very early to say or to make a judgment on to what extent the demonstrations will increase in its level and therefore pose a threat to the government. Up to this moment, I don't think the demonstrations poses a threat to the government.
Aysam Abu Hasabu, do you share that perspective? You're in Khartoum. The government has, of course, dismissed the significance of these protests, saying they don't amount to very much. Do you see it this way? And why isn't the opposition, your group, why isn't it lending its voice, its support to these protesters?
Yeah, well, let me begin by saying that I don't share Dr. Safwat Fanousi's opinion about how the description of the demonstrations in Khartoum right now. For me, it's not a quantitative question. It's rather qualitative question. The fact that demonstrations have been going on for some time persistently is in itself is a landmark in terms of expression of the people, the students who have always been the sparkle that starts revolutions or uprisings in any society, especially in Sudan. So therefore, I don't think we can measure what's going on in Khartoum right now. In fact, a few hundred meters from where we are recording this program now, there is, I've been through it, there is what you can call a real street upheavals, and you can call it a continuous revolution, not only of students, but of great segments of the society. And talking about how spread things are, how spread demonstrations are, you can talk about so many cities and towns in Sudan, which is an indicator of what is going on, what has been going on, not only for the past few days, but since this regime took over. What we see now is only what you call the tip of the iceberg.
Is it the tip of the iceberg?
What is coming up is still submerged.
Allow me to bring in Professor David Anderson. The government has seen this before. It has gone through a period of upheaval, of protest. Nothing much came of it. Is it consequential? Is it different this time around?
I think our two commentators already have given alternative views of how serious the matter is. And I think we are still waiting to see whether there will be critical mass. That is to say, will enough people come to the streets to protest? There is, of course, in Sudan, really quite a firm grip held by the government. And many people will be waiting to see quite how things are going to turn out. But my sense from looking at the social media in the last 24 hours has been that the government has a problem. It looks to me that this has got beyond the student cohort that was leading it and out into the wider public. It's also spread from Khartoum to Omdurman and to other major towns. And I think that is also quite significant. Now, the government has cracked down very hard on these protests in the last week, very hard indeed. But they're now going to have to do so mercilessly if they're going to stop a broader protest.
But can they afford to take these types of measures, Dr. Safwat Thanos? Can the government take tougher measures against the protesters, or are there too many risks if they do?
No, the government have clearly announced that it will take very firm measures against the demonstrations and will not be tolerable. The government is talking about no demonstration is allowed to go out without getting a legal permission. And as everyone knows, the government will not give and haven't been very lenient or tolerant with regard to giving permissions to the opposition to go out on the streets. And therefore, the message to the public in general is that any demonstrations will be met by the law, which basically means using tear gas to disperse the demonstration.
How important is it, Aysam Abu Hasabu, for opposition parties, your party and others? Yours has indeed worked with the government. A wing of your party, the Democratic Unionist Party, is coming under pressure for still being a part of this government, but nonetheless it is. How important will it be for the opposition to stop squabbling amongst themselves and actually support some of these protesters, at least in their demands? And where do you draw the line? Can this government still deliver on some of the protesters' main demands, or is it too late for that?
No, it's not too late. Actually, that's an understatement. Thinking that opposition parties are in disagreement. In fact, I think most of the opposition parties, or if not all of them, have agreed on one core issue. That is, this government is no longer able to run the country peacefully, and that it has failed in the major tasks that is supposed to be shouldered.
You say there's no disagreement, but some leading members of your own party are partners of this government. They work alongside this government.
Let me correct that. Actually, I'm from one faction of those parties that's not taking part in this government, and but this is actually besides the main point. The main point, if you allow me, is that so many people, so many segments of the society, political parties, NGOs, ordinary people sitting on the fence, have come to realize that the repression, injustice, lack of freedom of speech, all these atrocities, all these ugly features of this government has led to this situation, escalating the situation to a point of no return. Now, I think what we need to do is to really consider, are we heading towards the end of the tunnel, or does this government have any other options as well? We in the opposition, we don't think that there is another option except to go all the way.
To go all the way, Professor David Anderson, do you think the Sudanese people now have the appetite to go all the way, to bring about revolutionary change, with the benefit of hindsight, when they look at the somewhat chaotic situation in Egypt, in Libya, elsewhere in the region, Tunisia, of course? Do they feel that it may be perhaps better to stick with what they have?
I think that there is a danger here of misinterpreting the Sudan events simply as part of the Arab Spring phenomenon. I think that definitely people in Sudan are looking to Egypt and Tunisia, and they are learning lessons. We know that from what we see and hear on social media. But the story in Sudan in the last 15 to 18 months has been one of savage and rapid economic decline. The government has lost control of its economy as a consequence of the split with the South and the war that is now, at least putatively, still raging with the South. So we have a situation where the government has lost its ability to manage the economy effectively and they are in free fall. The economic changes brought in last week, which were billed as austerity measures, have had a devastating impact. Fuel has risen by more than 60% in price. Food prices were already rocketing and have gone even higher. There are serious problems here. It's those immediate material problems that are bringing more people onto the streets. That's the real background here, and that specific context might be more important than anything to do with the Arab Spring.
Dr. Fanos, do you agree with this perspective? I mean, is this a government that is simply in a hopeless situation? Did it have to take these drastic measures because of the ongoing dire economic situation, or should it have waited? Should it have calculated a little bit the consequences? Do you think it can still take the edge off of the protests if it decreases some of the burdens on the most affected people, or has it gone beyond this? Are there too many calls now for the regime to just simply go?
I agree with your guest in England, and I would argue that the recent economic measures came too late. These economic measures or cautions, considerations should have been adopted in January 2011 when the referendum on the future of the South was settled in favor of the independence of the South or secession. Because the government should have accepted the fact since then that the oil in the South is no longer, shouldn't be part of its budget, should no longer be considered part of the resources of the income of export earnings in Sudan. Nevertheless, the government went and designed a budget for the year, for the second part of 2011 and in 2012, assuming that it is still earning some portion of the oil income, which it claims is the right or its right in return for the South using the pipeline and the export facilities. The government was shocked by the decision of the South to close the wells, the oil wells, and therefore it started since January, when that decision was made, to consider the economic measures in order to adapt the budget and to stabilize the currency. But there was strong opposition within the government itself with regard to these measures, realizing the effect, the political effect of these measures, which we have seen in the last 2 to 3 weeks.
Why weren't there contingency plans? Because the government knew this was going to happen. They knew that the South was going to actually vote in favor of secession.
This is precisely what I'm saying, is that this, I think, was the mistake of the government, that they didn't act much earlier with regard to adjusting the economic budget and the economic adjusting to the economic new economic realities. So when they found that there is no way but to take these measures, then they disagreed. There was a disagreement in the ruling political party about taking these measures. The National Assembly opposed in the beginning removing the subsidies from the fuel products and increasing the indirect taxes. But at the end, it has these measures, the government found that it has to take it, otherwise there will be an economic collapse.
Professor Anderson, a major miscalculation or a simple necessity?
Well, I think our commentator has put his finger on the crucial issue here. It's not so much that the opposition in Sudan has galvanized this kind of reaction. It is the fact that the ruling party, the NCP and its National Congress, its National Assembly, have had real difficulty squaring up to the reality of their position. The party is divided, and it's divided more than two ways. People can't make up their minds how they should handle this problem, and they can't make up their minds what they should do about the new realities that confront them diplomatically and politically. The government itself has been slow to respond, not because it hasn't seen the problem, but because it can't agree among itself.
The problems were a long time coming. Aysam Abu Hasabu, then, let me put this to you. Why wait so long? You voice very articulately your disagreement, your loss of faith with the government. Why haven't you done more in order to push for the government to take the measures needed to diversify into alternative sources of revenue for the population, to do many things that could have improved the lot of ordinary civilians? Are you simply waiting, hedging your bets to see which way the winds will blow?
Because we have no way to reach the government. They don't give us their ears. They don't listen to advices from the opposition. But let me comment.
But some of the members of your own group, I repeat, are part of this government. How can you say you failed to reach them?
No, we have no members in our party, the DUP Unified, in this government. In fact, in all opposition parties, we don't have any members in the executive or the legislative. But let me, Madam, let me make
But let me just clarify that
comment.
Some wings within the DUP do not belong to the government, but others do. A simple point of clarification, that there are different wings pulling in different directions.
We do not, yes, but we do not call ourselves wings. We are completely fledged political parties registered according to the law of 2007. We are different parties with different strategies, with different policies, but this is besides the issue. What I want to make sure is that we have, at a certain stage, right before the elections, the elections that were supposed to usher the democratic transformation, we presented our goodwill that we were willing to go through democratic transformation, saving the country what would be coming up like what we experience now. Now, I think we should be clear about one thing, if I may say so. It's all metaphorical. I mean, you cannot truly draw the analogy between the Arab Spring and what you can call Sudanese summer or Sudanese autumn. The thing is that we have different circumstances that at work. The diversity of the society, the problems that have been dragging on for 23 years, the government that has employed a policy of trial and error every time. This cannot just drag on. I mean, we are in a situation where people are being put into experimental labs by trying different theories on them, whether economic, social, or otherwise. This is why I think you cannot give advice to someone who is not willing to listen to it.
That could be said of other societies as well. But Dr. Fanos, let me just get your thoughts on this. Do you see in any way that the days of the president, the current leadership, are numbered, that people really want an alternative to this rule?
The answer to your question really depends on the number of the people who will go down on the streets to demonstrate against this government. And looking at the history of Sudan and looking at the experience of the Arab Springs, the numbers has to be on a large scale, culminating in a civil disobedience movement that will bring life to a standstill and therefore will force the army or will induce the army to step in and change the government. This is what happened in Sudan in 1964 and in 1985. And this is what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt.
Professor David Anderson, if we could just put this in a more regional but also international context, what will be the calculations that perhaps are being made in some Western capitals, in Washington, in Paris, in London, when it comes to what should happen in Khartoum, whether it's better to keep and support tacitly a weak government, a weak leadership, for fear of what the alternative scenario could throw up?
Well, I think this is the question for the West. They'll be watching Khartoum very closely and they'll be concerned because for them, they would like to see a more liberal and perhaps, to be frank, a more compliant government in Khartoum. They would like to see a government that was more willing to negotiate on terms with the South and so on. And now they will worry that if there is a split within the ruling elite in Khartoum, that split might well result in a new leader emerging who is even more belligerently opposed to certain things they'd like to see than is Mr. al-Bashir. They'll also be looking very guardedly at what's going on in Syria. At the moment, the West, I think, has enough on its plate worrying about the Syrian events without creating a similar scenario in Khartoum. Similarly, countries within the Arab League, some of whom are friends of al-Bashir and Khartoum, they will not want to see another Arab country in that kind of dilemma. So some of them, I think, will do their best to try and dampen down what is going on in Khartoum.
Well, thank you to all of my guests for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. In Khartoum, Safwat Fanos and Aysam Abu Hassabu. And in Oxford, David Anderson. And thank you very much, as always, for joining us on Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your feedback. You can email us your thoughts at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.